Thank you very much, and welcome to Ecobuild. My name is Paul Oakley. I head up the BIM team at the BRE. Talked really about open standards for BIM and specifically in terms of where they're going for infrastructure. As I said, at the BRE, we provide a whole series of services. There's information about what's going on with BIM, certification, training, whole series of research projects looking at expansion. We also run this thing called Building Smart, which is a members organisation which is looking at global standards for open BIM adoption. Tomorrow, you'll be aware that it's actually BIM at BRE Day and pushing the UK strategy. But the issue with BIM is it starts with this B. There isn't any infrastructure in it, and that's the perception. But really, we're talking about the verb to build. So it doesn't matter whether it's infrastructure or building, but the main focus has been on the B bit. And again, there's multiple definitions of what BIM is, whether it's building information model, the thing that's produced, the building information model, how you produce that, or who, what, and when in terms of the information management that Andrew mentioned, which is in the UK government requirements and the standards, PAS 1192, BS 1192, etc. So in terms of this thing that BIM is generally perceived as, we have this graphical model, we have information, and then we have documentation which supports those. And the two things here are the single source of the truth from which the documentation is produced. So in building, it's very easy. We have these objects such as windows, doors. They know how they interact with things like walls, and they know how the things come together. But in the infrastructure world, it's not quite that easy in terms of the way the software, etc., works. Again, within building, we have this thing called IFC, Industry Foundation Classes, which is the open standard in terms of how information is exchanged. And that can be brought into a very basic text format that multiple software solutions can read and exchange. There's a huge development going on within the IFC open data structure, which is moving from 2x3, which has been around for some time, into 4, and moving on into the future. And again, different methods in terms of how we can share and exchange that is being undertaken. And under Building Smart, there's various websites from the UK, the technical site, or the international, where you can find out further information on that. Now, as I mentioned, we're also looking at this open data standards. So there's a particular focus room looking at infrastructure within Building Smart International, which is looking at all the sort of things that can happen, and we need to look at design, procure, construct, operate, and how we can exchange open data for all of those stages. And there's only been some very small specific areas being looked at the moment. Now, when you look at infrastructure and the environment, you're really talking about bridges, roads, rail, tunnels, etc., and they all basically deal with mud. Okay, and how we deal with that. But then you then have terrain modeling and you have alignment, so things going along paths. And they all create their own sets of issues in terms of how you share and collaborate information. So the initial work carried out by the various teams globally were looking at alignment. So how could you deal with things that go along paths, which are generally roads, bridges, and tunnels. And they all have this IFC alignment requirement in terms of how you can move things along a straight line. But the perception was you could just draw a line on plan initially and you could follow that. But actually, you're also looking at vertical alignment as well as the 2D, which is really the whole 3D alignment of things. And then what happens when things intersect and meet one another? Junctions, how do you deal with all those sorts of things? So we have all this work in terms of going on globally, how we can try and resolve all these issues. And there's work going on, which is basically now brought out IFC 4x1, which is the work on alignment, which is the initial standard there, and that's being taken through at the moment. So we now have solutions for bridges. We now have definitions for roads in terms of a basic alignment. But when you actually look at the requirements of all the other things that we need to start thinking about and how we need to develop all these standards, there's still an enormous amount of work that needs to be undertaken if we're going to basically move it into solutions that we need for full life cycle management and exchange of information. So we have basic things like bridges. A lot of this is common to what's in buildings. But then there are specific things which require to be added into the infrastructure world. You know, things like a tunnel. Well, the first thing on a tunnel is you need a void. You need something there to extract from. And that's completely different to the way you generally work within buildings, where you're building up into space. And then you get a shield environment and how you deal with that. You also get things like different stratas. So within building, it's you've got walls, so you get a nice 100mm brick, you get a cavity, you get some insulation, you get block work, plaster, etc. Very clear delineation of objects. When you move into an infrastructure world, particularly in groundwork and stratas and that, you get sand into clay, into other soil types, you get different rocks merging and mixing. It's a completely different scenario to what you're dealing with in the built environment. And then you get into environment type considerations. So we're carrying out some work for the Environment Agency, carrying a research project there. But when you're actually looking at things like definitions of a mud bank, something which is there at one point of the tide and is not there at another point, again, the whole concept of how things move and change is completely different. So traditionally under IFC, we have this definition of a site which has a fixed boundary, etc. And suddenly you get into these unbounded things. We get definitions of IFC features. So the whole concept in terms of how these structures of data comes together needs to be re-evaluated. And then we look at the software solutions. So within building, I said you've got these object-based solutions. When you move into infrastructure, they work in a completely different way. They tend to work in line work, surfaces, etc. So when you're trying to extract information that can be used for the asset lifecycle, it becomes far harder. So we get scenarios where we have in Civil 3D an export to IFC, but it only has building objects, not the infrastructure, the objects that are needed. And you can't get out the appropriate properties that you're going to need for quantification and other things. But the information is there, so a little application to go in, look at the things. You can get that information if you can write API applications to get in and suck it out. So we need all these software tools developed. We need requirements how we're going to do things to drive this stuff forwards. So there's a lot of work going on within Building Smart. There's a technical group meeting today, meeting in Watford, discussing this thing. There's an international conference happening in April in Rotterdam. So there's a lot of work moving on, driving this, but we need more involvement from industry, helping drive these standards and move things along. Okay, so quick hammer about what's going on in terms of open data standards within infrastructure and how we're trying to move this whole agenda. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you very much, Paul. Paul, quick question for you. We are bang up against the time, but BIM is still very much seen, I suppose, with suspicion around the whole of the infrastructure sector. Why is that? And what are we going to do about it?
One aspect is the lack of tools. So the tools are very much based on traditional CAD, line work, modelling, the lack of objects and that. The way you actually can then exchange information is linked into particular requirements. So we need all these things resolving, and we need the things to basically move on. So there's a lot of development required in this area.
No, because I suppose one of the things I suppose that I do always see around the whole world of BIM is that it's still very much seen as I suppose, a design or a drawing tool rather than a management tool. I mean, is this the sort of thing which Building Smart's going to try to get across in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, we have this issue that it's really start with the end in mind. And the problem that we've got is the capability in a lot of the tools is to provide the information that's required for life cycle, etc. But actually the designers are not necessarily asked for the correct information. So the whole thing that Andrew talks about in terms of employees' information requirements, that's basically where the client needs to define what they want to aid that life cycle so it be supplied by the design teams, the construct teams to move into the life cycle.
Paul, it's a huge subject there, but thanks for bringing us up to speed with that, and good luck with the Building Smart. Paul Oakley from BRE, thanks so much. Round of applause.